A very warm welcome to all of you to Poetry, Refuge, Exile, Voices of Migration. It's great to have you here with us today and great to be able to welcome our contributors. This session is part of Living God's Future Now, the online festival of theology, ideas and practice from Heart Edge. And Heart Edge itself is an international and ecumenical movement for renewal within the broad church, a network of churches growing compassionate responses to needs, cultural and commercial activities and congregational life. And we'll be posting more information about Heart Edge and Living God's Future Now events in the chat towards the end of the session. This is the third of a four-part series on the themes of migration, theology and community. And in this session, Lia Shimada and her guests will be exploring how poetry emerges from, gives voice to diverse experiences of exile, flight, abuse, hope, refuge, and belonging. There will be time for discussion later in the session, so we do want to encourage you to post any questions or comments that you have in the chat as soon as you have them, and we'll pick those up when we come to that discussion time in our program today. Feel free to use the chat to discuss and share amongst yourselves, but please do mute your mic unless you're invited to speak, as that minimizes background noise for everyone else. This series is based on mapping faith, theologies of migration and community, which brings together over 35 writers, poets, artists and practitioners from primarily Jewish, Muslim and Christian backgrounds. And royalties of that book are being donated to the Helen Bamber Foundation, with which St. Martin in the Fields has a long-standing relationship. We'll hear more about the foundation later in the session, and we're particularly pleased to welcome representatives from the foundation as part of this session. Our thanks to the Susanna Wesley Foundation, who are a co-sponsor of this event. So a very warm welcome to all our contributors, who will be introduced now by Dr. Lia Shimada. Lia is a geographer and theologian based at the University of Roehampton, where she serves as senior researcher for the Susanna Wesley Foundation and as associate chaplain of Whitelands College. She is the editor of Mapping Faith, Theologies of Migration and Community. Over to you, Lia. Thank you very much for all that you're going to share.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. Huge thanks to those of you who joined us in November and in February for the first two of these 4 sessions, and welcome to those of you who are joining us for the first time this afternoon. Today, I'm here with 4 of the poets who contributed to Mapping Faith. I will be introducing them as we go along, but before we get into the poetry, I wanted to share a little bit about the book. Mapping Faith is meant to be a dialogue. As Jonathan mentioned, it brings together different religious perspectives for a conversation about migration, faith, and community. It was a very large project. Over 35 contributors took part. These were writers, poets, artists, theologians, and practitioners from a broad range of predominantly, although not exclusively, Jewish, Muslim, and Christian backgrounds. From the outset, this was designed to be a book for general readers. And in fact, the briefing that I gave to every contributor, regardless their faith background or their professional role, was to imagine that you are communicating with a book group that is meeting within a faith tradition that is not your own. It was a worthwhile exercise, not least of all to me as the editor, as much as for anyone else. Within the book, there are 3 broad sections. The first section is on faith encounters. The second section is on sacred text, and the third is on diaspora. So with these themes in mind, we explored some big questions. What is migration? How do we understand the presence of God in people on the move? How does faith shape migration and vice versa? And how does migration shape our understanding of community in the context of faith? So hopefully the book contains something for everyone. Alongside the essays that you would expect to find in a book of this size, I also commissioned 3 visual artists, and they each produced some really stunning art for the project. The 4th series in this series for Hard Edge will be looking at the art in the book. And I commissioned several poets as well. Already through the series of Hard Edge, we've heard from Padra Gotuma and Yvonne Green, and today we will hear from 4 more of the poets. The book was published last June by Jessica Kingsley Publishers. This is an imprint of Hachette. The publisher has very kindly arranged a discount of 25% for copies of the book that are purchased directly through its website. At the end of the event, we'll provide information about this in the chat space. As Jonathan mentioned earlier, all royalties from book sales will be donated to the Helen Bamber Foundation. I'm really delighted that we're able to support this organization and looking forward to hearing more about their work later on this afternoon. So for today's event, I've brought together Alison, Tawona, Jennifer, and Amir for a conversation about migration and poetry. In particular, I've asked them to grapple with questions of refuge and voice and exile. I'm going to introduce each poet, and then we'll give them a few minutes to speak or to read a poem, maybe both depending on their time management. And after we've heard from all 4 of them, Jonathan is going to open the discussion for questions and reflections from you. Please do type these in the chat as we go along, and we'll try our very best to respond to as many as possible when the time comes. Finally, we'll hear from the Helen Bamber Foundation, and we will finish with one final poem. One of the foundation's clients contributed a poem that she'd written, and which Alison, Tawona, Jennifer, and Amir will read together. So let's turn first to Alison and Tawona, who are joining us today from Scotland. Alison Phipps is Professor of Languages and Intercultural Studies at the University of Glasgow. She holds the UNESCO Chair in Refugee Integration through Languages and the Arts. She also co-convenes the Glasgow Refugee Asylum and Migrant Network, and she's an active member of the Iona community. Alison made not 1 but 2 contributions to the book, for which I am very, very grateful. Alongside the poetry that she and Tawona produced together, Alison also wrote a chapter that explores what refuge means for migrant women who have experienced sexual violence. She does this brilliantly through a really hard-hitting retelling of the story of the rape of Tamar. It's, in my opinion, one of the most powerful chapters in the book, and it felt to me like a real honor to be able to include it. Tawona Sitholé is a poet, playwright, and storyteller. Originally from Zimbabwe, he is currently artist in residence for the UNESCO program at the University of Glasgow, where he works alongside Alison. In 2005, Tawona co-founded the arts organization Seeds of Thought, which is based at the Centre for Contemporary Arts in Glasgow. And if that wasn't enough, Tawona is also a musician. At the very end of today's event, we'll hear him play briefly on an instrument that has been in his family for 6 generations. As poets, Alison and Tawona have collaborated on several projects together, including their joint book, The Warriors Who Do Not Fight, which was published in 2018. For Mapping Faith, they contributed 6 poems. These poems take the form of call and response, which feels exactly right for a book that is at its heart about dialogue. Alison and Tawona, thank you very much for being with us this afternoon.
It's lovely to be with you, Lia.
Thank you. In reading the poems that you contributed to Mapping Faith alongside your other work, I've been really struck by the ways that you explore and interrogate voice and voicelessness, and what this means for people caught up in migration. The question that I wanted to ask you today, as both poets and as activists, is how does poetry speak to power? I'll turn it over to you now.
And as part of that move of turning a question over to me, I'm going to turn the question over to Tawona and see how he wants to respond.
Thank you, Lia, and everyone for organizing today. It's really good to be here. And I'm going to turn the question over to a poem in response, if I may. There is no one to check you in or check you out. No one to weigh your baggage or touch you up. No body in booth, hands above head, feet behind line. There is no unheard of herd of people. No holding pens, no paper cuts, no board, no number, no pass, no gate. There is no priority clearance, no catwalk for the privileged. No AU, non-AU, no dignity stripping interview. No very, very verification of identity. Kwewe, diwani, naiwe, uvepi, konaiwe, wendepi. No receptors, no detectors, no specialized interceptors, no thermal scanners scanning for super diseases. In fact, there's only us and the trees and elephant grass. For now, in a manner of speaking, in a matter of seconds, we are across the frontier, border crossing in Togo.
Tawona, look, this is what you say about that moment when we were crossing the border in Togo, but we all know that there are always several different versions of the truth, and that the version that matters is the version that matters for the decision. And I'm here to tell you that it wasn't elephant grass, was it? Surely it was flax. And the ground was stony, and my feet were bare and close to the broken road. I was just walking across a road into a field, and there were friends, or maybe now former friends, with me. And our skin was on fire because the day was pregnant, with gifts coming close to their time. You knew we stood on hallowed ground, as did I. The natural ditch between a road and a field is a place where magic and mischief have always been made. There were admonishments, but they were laughing, not fearful. There were remonstrations, but they only served to strengthen the resolve and the sense of safety between us. I saw no elephants in the grass, no snakes or angels either. But the flax was growing, the twine, which would weave enchantments, opening this improbable ground beneath our bare feet to be another unstoppable conduit for the stories between us about to be born. So that's our response to your question, Lia, to the question about how poetry might speak to power, and how we found ourselves in the middle of a long conversational argument, dialogue about what it means to live, both of us as migrants, but in very different ways, in very different contexts, living a life that has been marked profoundly by migration, but where questions of power and narrative and truth all have to be repeatedly problematized. Tawona, I'm just wondering if you might want to tell the story of what happened when we crossed that power marker in Togo, compared to, say, what happens when you cross the power marker of the UK border.
Yes, thanks everyone for humoring us. We basically, this poem came out of this moment where we were on a project together that we were exploring what happens to the body as it passes through different borders. And for me, holding a passport that allows me free entry into about 18 countries, and Alison having one that allows her into about 160 countries without any questions, you can imagine what used to happen. That choreography of someone going through and someone getting left behind and being questioned and everything. And so at a certain point, we were in Ghana in an area called Aflao. And as we were driving along this particular road, the driver mentioned that on the left is Togo and on the right is Ghana. And we realized that we were on this frontier that had no mechanization to stop us crossing. So Alison said, stop the car, stop the car. And we did a ceremonial symbolic crossing of that border. We took off our shoes and we crossed the road. Alison, you can take it from there.
Yeah, yeah, and we were with somebody who'd had to sign a document saying that I, Alison, as a guest and as somebody with a visa to enter Ghana, would not violate the immigration regulations of the country of Ghana. And there was this one moment where we jump over the border and jump back, where I'm not quite sure whether that might have actually constituted a violation of the border regulations, but it actually was a dance. And it felt like a dance, and it was full of laughter and magic and mischief, as I say in my answer to that poem. And it's a poem from the book that Lia mentioned, which again we wrote. It came out of the experiences of 2015, where the hospitality crisis of the global north was in full swing, and where we were really, both of us, deeply embedded in the experiences of people wanting to seek refuge, but also of speaking in many different ways to powerful people, be it through protests and vigils in the square in Glasgow, one of which was worldwide, the Syria vigils, which were organised by one of my students. And which took place across about 30 countries worldwide, but all of which were really trying to advocate for humanity. And in that space, realizing that the angry tonality of blame needed tempering and shifting into a register that was maybe more poetic, but also used silence and also used humor. And Tawona, I mean, you've used poetry for a very long time as a way of addressing really difficult, thorny issues. And I just wonder if you want to say a little about what it is that you find in poetry that you don't find in maybe angry slogans.
Well, poetry is wonderful because poetry happens to you. If you're, part of the poet's work is not writing always, it's being receptive to moments that come. And so like this moment that came in a flower when we realized there's an opportunity to do this bit of mischief. So mischief is very important. So you really spend your time, contemplating and thinking, but sometimes just about being receptive and a bit of mischief. That's how I approach it. So I think poetry can speak to power in those ways. A bit of mischief, a bit of recognizing, like the story we were telling. Poetry is storytelling. So this story we're telling now, we can tell the story of the many militarized borders that we were trying to cross, but we can tell also this one of a border that exists, that is freely crossed on a day-to-day basis. So poetry has that. It's a reflection, and so yeah. Sometimes it. For me, I'm glad it steers me away from. The angry place is not a very comfortable place to stand in for me anyway. So yeah.
One of my favorite poets, and who makes me think a lot about this, and we're coming up to the end of our little bit of time for dialogue, but is R.S. Thomas, who was a great influence on my youth. And just the other day when Tawona and I were talking about being with you today, I was sharing with him a little quote from R.S. Thomas, who says that all people talk to themselves. Some are overheard, and they are poets, which I really like the gentleness of that. But also another quote that I use a lot from R.S. Thomas, from his last volume of poetry, where he says poetry is that which enters the intellect by way of the heart. And Tawona and I have found a lot in our work, and where we do spend a lot of time, that old cliche goes, speaking truth to power, that we spend a lot of time using poetry as a force that's powerful in the way that water is powerful, or in the way that the roots of a tree can break open the ground so that something else can grow or something else can happen. And Tawona, along with others of the artists in my team, will regularly come along. So if I have a major keynote to do on a global platform with hundreds of people coming along, I will usually ask if one of the artists can join me, and they will then interrupt me in the middle of my talk and really confound the audience and allow that dynamic of power that goes between man and woman, black and white, poet of the South, poet of the North, that will confound those assumptions and show that maybe there's another dialogue to be had when we get past the fighting and move into a space that is much more dialogical. So I think, Lia, that brings us up to our 12 minutes allocated time. But I know both of us will be really happy to take questions and talk more, and particularly Tawona, about the amazing poetic tradition that he grew up with, which is far more interesting than the limericks that I was taught to write in school.
No way.
Maybe we'll hear a limerick from Tawona later. Thank you, both of you. I'm so glad that you opened this space with a poem, and I'm delighted that it was as a call and response as well. Thank you for that. We're going to turn next to Jennifer Lange. Jennifer, where are you? There you are. Jennifer is a London-based poet, writer, editor, and researcher with a long-standing interest in the literature of exile. She's the editor of 4 anthologies of exiled literature, and she's also a published poet in her own right. In fact, a new volume of her poetry titled The Search is about to be published by Victorina Press. So congratulations for that, Jennifer.
Thank you.
Jennifer came to my attention through her work with Exiled Writers, Inc. She's the organization's founding director. I hope maybe Ben could put the website in the chat space. That would be helpful. Since 2000, Exiled Writers, Inc. has provided really outstanding support for exiled writers, refugees, and migrants. Even through the pandemic, it was hosting regular events and workshops where exiled writers can have a platform to share their work and to speak out against oppression and abuse. For her contribution to my own book, Jennifer wrote a beautiful chapter about Exiled Writers, Inc. She then spent hours and hours and hours chasing permissions from various writers and publishers so that we could include excerpts of contemporary poetry in her chapter, which if any of you have produced a book will know this is a real gift. The result is a beautifully written essay that allows other voices to shine through. Jennifer, so much of your work is about creating opportunities so that people in exile can flourish artistically. You do this as an organizer, of course, but you also do this as a writer, an editor, and a poet. In your opinion, what can literature help us to understand about the experience of exile?
Okay, well, hello everyone. I'm going to draw mainly on the work of exiled writers and read a little poem of my own right at the end. So here we go. In response to your question, the state of displacement causes an enormous rupture in the self. Having been cast out by the home country or had to flee, poets in exile are forced to confront the question of identity. So they negotiate constantly with a conflicting sense of self, feeling unstable and unable to find a place in the external world of exile. Experiencing a kind of limbo, physically here, but mentally there. They're unwilling to be in the host country, but unable to return. There are numerous examples of poets articulating this sense of alienation. In one of them, by the exiled Bosnian writer Himzo Skorupan, the poet phones his former home. And I'm just going to read a little snippet of his poem. It's called Neither Here Nor There, very aptly. I had my trepidations for a long time, but yesterday I could wait no more. I went to the phone and dialed a number, my number. At the other end of the line in my house, I heard an unknown voice saying that I wasn't there. I asked him if he knew what had happened to me, where I was. And he said that he had moved in recently and that he didn't know. And the poem concludes with, and this is the way things are. I am not really here, and over there I am no more. So In my experience, most exiled poets express minimal affinity with the new external space of exile, portraying it negatively. This is due not only to their sense of destabilization, but also to their negative reception by the host community, representing their inner struggles bound with difficult experiences of immigration, detention, and racism. The writers express an underlying tension and a reluctance to trust. I remember, for example, the Congolese poet and playwright Jean-Louis Ntadi's bitter poem about being imprisoned in Campsfield Detention Center. This sense of alienation is compounded by the devastation in the country of origin, stimulating the need to create positive memory of the past home in the desperate search for identity. In fact, it's interesting that most poets of refugee background idealize the past, drawing on what the scholar Svetlana Boym calls restorative nostalgia. This notion emphasizes the return home in memory and the positive reconstruction of the lost home. In a sense, it functions as an escape from the difficult present and selects past experiences without dwelling on the pain of the past. So, for example, poets draw on memories of the southern mountain slopes, of the brown sugar dawn, of Asmara by night, of Kinshasa the beautiful, of the nightingale. And some women remember life with female relatives sleeping on the roof in the hot south, the interior life of the women's hammam, and childhood memories with the family. However, the Iraqi poet Adnan al-Sayegh is a bit of a rebel. He refuses nostalgia, emphatically declaring boredom with nostalgic memories in exile. And I'll read a little nostalgic poem by the Kurdish poet Mohammed Kaki. It's very short. It's called Homesickness. If one day your jasmine sweet memory came with the zephyrs of spring, ruffling the pages of my poetry, which drop of rain would wash away my homesickness? Yet, if you think about it, conflicts are produced between the framing of the violent homeland and the homeland of beauty prior to the violence. The paradox of nostalgia for the home country, despite the trauma experienced, is for me reminiscent of my parents' ambivalent stance towards Germany, a kind of love-hate relationship. The love relating to their wonderful youth there before the Nazis' terrible regime, which caused them to flee for their lives. So nostalgia invokes a sense of loss of the past and of mourning for it. And I will end with a poem from my forthcoming debut collection called The Search. And it's about a Bosnian man I met who was exiled in Bologna, Italy. Sorry, about an Iranian man exiled in Bologna, Italy, who was involved in a theatre project there. And my poem is called Unmasked. Huge finger shadow on the wall, a long arm pointing. He runs between the brilliant light. The spotlight dazzles. He flits between brightness and darkness, a rehearsal of Oedipus. Outside, the cool air of a Bologna night. His face is a smiling mask. Weeping man whose tears are buried deep. Tehran sleeps within him. He is the snow of the Alborz mountains. He is the water bubbling over the rocks. He is the fresh green of Nowruz leaves. He wears a mask of tragedy. He suffers the eternal torture of memory. He can never return. His scream bounces off the stoic city walls. The curtains swish closed. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. I look forward to your book being published and reading that again. Our final panelist is an extraordinary poet, writer, and human being, Amir Darwish. Where are you, Amir?
Yes.
Amir was born in Aleppo, and at the age of 23, he came to the UK by hiding beneath a lorry that was traveling from Belgium. The lorry pitched up with Amir in it in Teesside in the north of England. 5 years later, Amir was granted refugee status, and he became a UK citizen in 2008. Amir currently lives in London, where he's working on his doctorate. The first part of his autobiography, which has the fabulous title, From Aleppo Without Love, was published in 2017. And Amir assures me that the second installment is forthcoming. When I was piecing together the chapter order for the manuscript, I decided to end the book with Amir's poetry. It seemed entirely fitting that the tenacity and the resilience of Amir's poems should be the last words that we read in this book. Amir, as I was rereading the poems that you contributed to Mapping Faith, I found myself marveling at how generous you are with your life and your story. I know from working with you over the past few years that this generosity comes with a price, that it can be very costly. And I'm thinking in particular about a wonderful poem that you wrote and published, which was then co-opted by people whose theology and politics you absolutely do not support. In walking alongside you in a very small way through this really difficult experience, I've had a glimpse of how much responsibility a poem can carry in navigating some really challenging cultural politics. So what I wanted to ask you is, from where you stand, how does poetry speak to that complicated intersection between identity and culture and society?
First of all, thank you very much for inviting me and for having me, and thanks to the organizers and everyone involved. Well, I think a poet often appoints himself or herself to be a cultural or social physician, and rightly so. They should do that, I think. They often get into trouble with authorities and at times with society at large, as they are challenging social cultural norms, which make them a very small minority amongst nations. So the poets, they find themselves a very small minority in nations because of that. If you ask me personally, I would say we need poets as much as we need doctors, as poets question everything, and in doing so, we keep penetrating social rules that became rigid for years. Only then people start to move forward intellectually, and that is by questioning why they do the things they do. For example, why fish and chips is famous British dish and not hummus? Is it connected geographically? Is our culture stuck with us until we die? Can we change our habits? Can we abandon what we learned in childhood and what shaped our personality? All these questions, I think, can be asked by poets. However, I don't think poets are responsible for providing answers. It's the duty of maybe anthropologists and sociologists and historians and other experts to provide answers. And in that way, poets become almost like how do I call this? Civil servants in their nations, and provide a public service and putting things in the right way, pointing out mistakes and doubting everything. If I recall correctly, it was Aristotle who, alongside being a philosopher, was also a poet, who used to walk in the streets, and every time he saw a politician, asked him, "What did you do for your people today?" That's why politicians used to avoid seeing Aristotle altogether, because he kept them in check. I think of the other example, the pre-Islamic poets, rather. Those poets were the registrars of the tribes. They recorded death, birth, events, all major incidents. Even the Prophet Muhammad, the Prophet of the religion of Islam, had a poet help him writing the Quran, which is one of the most influential books today, helping millions in following the religion of Islam. And by the way, it's written in a poetic form. But I think, and that's the most important thing, and that's only my humble opinion, of course, as a poet, and this is my humble opinion, as I said, should do that to emphasize the human identity, or should emphasize the human identity, and that's the most vital thing for a poet. Then after that, questioning everything in their culture and society at large, as I said. I'm of course not telling poets how they should write, but I believe this should be done in a lucid and a clear writing for the academic to understand, and also the average man in the street to read and engage with. So pointing out where society has gone wrong, alongside emphasizing the human identity of ourselves, is something I try to do in the poem Where I Come From, which goes something like this. It's part of the latest poetry collection, Dear Refugee, published by Smokestack, and the poem called Where I Come From. From the earth I come, from the heart of Africa, from the kidneys of Asia, from India with its spices I come, from a deep Amazonian forest, from a Tibetan meadow I come, from an ivory land, from far away, from everywhere around me, from where there are trees, mountains, rivers, and seas, from here, there, and everywhere, from the womb of the Mediterranean I come, from a mental scar, from closed borders, from a camp with 1,000 tents, from a bullet wound, from the face of a lonely child, from a single mother's sigh, from a hole in an inflatable boat about to sink, from a bottle of water for 50 to share, from frozen snot in a toddler's nose, from the tear on the father's cheek, from a hungry stomach, from a graffiti that reads, I was here once, from a missing limb, like a human, I come to share the space. So that was my answer. If there's a remaining time, I would keep it so we'll have extra time for questions and answers and etc.
Thank you, Amir. It's so moving to hear you read that poem. That poem that Amir wrote and just read also appears in Mapping Faith as well, in a slightly different form. And that brings us to time for audience discussion and reflections. So I'm going to turn this over to Jonathan to chair. Thanks, Jonathan.
That's great. Thank you, Lia, and thanks for everything that's been shared so far. So do drop your comments and questions into the chat, and we'll try and pick those up and respond to them in the next 10 minutes or so. I'm going to go to Oksana first, who's very helpfully posted a number of responses to what's been shared so far. And in one of those, you were talking about the notion of complexity of identity with immigration status, homeland distance, and homesickness, something you're very familiar with. Would you like to unmute and just share a little of your experiences then for our panelists to respond.
Sure. Thank you. Hello, everyone. I'm Oksana. And but yeah, so I resonate with some of the things that were being said and what Jennifer was reading and sharing. I don't necessarily, I'm in US, but I can completely, and I'm not a refugee, but I have been away from my homeland since I was 9 years old. I left there, I lived with my family, grew up. So I lived in 2 different countries. I was born in Angola, Africa, left when I was 9, migrated to Portugal to live with my sister. So I've been living, and then I moved to US as well to live with my sister. So I've been living with family, but it's been quite painful. I was away from my parents. Well, my father passed away, but pretty much I was just healing. I think the pandemic helped me heal even for deeper wounds, my past. And then I wrote more about my story. But pretty much, just to make a long story short, my relationship with my mother was pretty much over the phone and cyber due to immigration status. I did have, when I came to US when I was 15, my visa expired. And then I was like undocumented and I have to figure that out. And I wanted to go to school to be a doctor. So it was a very complicated process with immigration and getting the renewal, which I have. And, I do, and I'm legally now, but it was a very excruciating, painful process trying to figure out who you are already in a culture that I didn't fit in anywhere, in a culture that I don't fit in. I didn't speak English. So I'm with a new family. So there was like a lot of dynamics that I understand as far as the complexity of not just the culture being new, being in US, but I had my own culture too. There was complexities and I didn't know who I was. And then my identity was, I knew who I was when I was my parents and I'm trying to get back there. So I understand what all those, everything that was being mentioned as far as being foreign and, and then your accent and people always asking you like, you're different, but where are you from? And so I'm really familiar with the identity, homesickness, and I was separated from my mom for like 23 years. We were reunited in 2019, December. And really, I really felt like that reunion, not only to see my mom, but also I got to see my brother that I haven't seen since I was 15 and his family. But that really brought closure to my wound pain of a long time. And it really helped me healed to really that long past wounds. So I think that's kind of like my story. And I just wanted to share. Thank you so much, Jennifer and Tawona and Amir, for sharing that because it's real. It's really a reality. And it's true that people go through things. And although I know I'm not a refugee, but I can so much assimilate and feel very familiar with immigration status, the complexity of identity and not fitting in. So, but that's pretty much my story.
Thank you so much. That's we're very grateful to you for sharing all of that. Would any of the panelists like to respond to those experiences, which would no doubt be shared by many others? Jennifer?
I feel there of a kind of empathy, even though I'm not a refugee myself or migrant, exile, deracinated and so on. Recently, I've been looking through files, which were my parents' files that I discovered in our loft. And I really thought it was time to sort through them. And they referred to two aspects: the relatives, my parents' immediate families who did not survive the Holocaust, but so that my parents were the only survivors of their respective families. And yet this was a narrative they did not speak to me about. And it was clearly far too painful. My mother suffered a lot from guilt feelings. I only know in retrospect through reading a medical report that I found in that file. Then there was the issue of my parents' statelessness because the Nazis had removed German identity from all Jews. And they were stateless for quite a few years here. And it was problematic to apply for British identity. So I could go on and on, but there are just so many aspects that I kind of understand, even though, as I said, I'm not a refugee.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. I think Amir was going to come in as well. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting input from Roxana and what Jennifer has just said. For me, I feel what's discussed here is basically the idea of home and the feeling of home. What makes home? Was it the memory? Was it the geographical place? Was it the certain people? Was it anything else that connect you as a human being? And many poets, as the poem read by Jennifer at the end of her question, by that, was it the Serbian poet? I want to get the name from you, Jennifer, later, who he found himself at home and he found himself not there and he's neither here. So there's always that dilemma with poets and with everyone who goes through the immigration system, who leaves home, and they want to settle, but they don't find themselves really settling, and they have a nostalgia to the old place, but there is a roots at the same time in the new place.
Thank you so much for that. I'm going to go to Sue Miller next. Sue, you were loving the notion of poetry opening up questions and helping us to value questions. So do you want to unmute and just share your thinking in that regard?
Yes, well, thank you all. I enjoyed it, all of this, but I just particularly picked up that point, as did somebody else, about, you know, saying we need poets as much as we need doctors, which well, I don't know whether it was as much as, but alongside doctors. I read somewhere else once that we need theologians as much as we need management specialists, doctors, or anything else. So the notion of recognising the different contributions that we make to sort of understanding our world. And I think also the point about poetry opening up questions, and I believe, was it Amir, you were suggesting that, you know, leave it to these other disciplines to provide the answers. I think those other disciplines can learn from poetry that, you know, questions and looking deeper is actually something that we often need to do, because we do tend to leap across from problem to solution, rather than exploring the truths that can become uncovered as you delve deeper and see different ways of seeing the world. And I suppose it's a more interpretive, a sort of phenomenological approach. So really, all I'm saying is that I love hearing what Amir said a few moments ago, and it really resonated with me. And I want us to ask more questions and have more dialogue. And I love the fact that this is at the heart of the book that Lia's edited, and that the conversations we're having now in this series, that we're opening things up, which we won't resolve, but need airing and need us to turn up differently in other places, having heard what we're hearing. I think it is. Yeah.
Thank you. That's tremendously helpful. So any responses from any of our panelists to those thoughts around questioning and opening up issues? Alison, thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much. I think Tawona's gone to get an answer that is not that's not verbal, but whilst he's getting that ready, I was just, as you were speaking just there, I was immediately thinking of Walt Whitman, Leaves of Grass, and what he says in that poem. And it's one that I returned to many times, was used by Walter Brueggemann as well in some of his work on the prophetic and the power of prophecy, not to predict a future, but much more importantly to shape a space in which a different future, a future which is just and which is bountiful and which is merciful, might take place. And he starts his book citing Whitman in Leaves of Grass, and he cites this extract: "After the seas are all crossed, as they seem already crossed, after the great captains and engineers have accomplished their work, after the noble inventors, after the scientist, the chemist, the geologist, the ethnologist, finally shall come the poet worthy of that name, the true Son of God, shall come singing his songs. And I love that poem because it doesn't say that, you know, the chemist and the anthropologist and the accountant, my husband upstairs, beavering away on the absolutely egregious effects of the overseas development aid cuts to the humanitarian aid organization that he runs, all the way through to anyone with any form of competency, including Jonathan there typing away and checking the chat, that, you know, all of these are part of the best that humankind can do when they bring their powers to particularly difficult questions of how we might live together in such a way that we might flourish one another, which is me citing the mission statement for the Scottish government at the moment. And I think it's really important to remember that when we all talk to each other in these different discursive formations, you know, half my life I have to talk about reprofiling and cross-budget subsidization and all of this kind of language that Simon Weil said was part of the middle range, not the upper range of the best we can do, but words which will pass, which are tired, which cannot ultimately serve us to cut through. Finally comes the poet. But I'll let Tawona respond because I think he's got a really nice object that he might do that with.
Thanks, everyone. This is a very energizing discussion. I'm just showing you this, which I wore for the Commonwealth Games in 2014. So it was a great laugh when we were standing next to the police as they wore the jackets that said police, and we wore ours that said poet. So we were performing poetry to people standing in queues to to help people feel you know, less of the burden of standing. I'm just going to add to what others have said about, you know, poets that make us notice, you know, the power in everyday things, as well as stretching our imaginations to places that we fear to tread. You know, poets live in the forest, metaphorically, where most people sit in the homestead, where the paths are clear and the spaces have been shaped by our feet and our hands. Poets go in the forest where there is danger and the unknown. And just as a way of example of how important poetry is, the sense of poetry is, we go to a wedding and we sit in the audience, and it is not us leaning over the shoulder of the couple, seeing them signing the paper, that allows us the sense that these people are married. But we are happy to hear those words being exchanged, along with whatever symbolic items, maybe rings or whatever. But it is those words. When those words are spoken, we sit in the audience and we return home and speak to our friends and say, so-and-so got married at the weekend, without glimpsing any official document. And this is the power of poetry.
Wonderful. Thank you both so much. That's tremendous. We've got a question now from Kate Ellis, who's wondering if any of the poets have insights to share on writing and reading out poetry in a second language. Anyone like to pick that one up for us? Has that stumped our panel?
Yes, I have a particular person in mind here when responding to this remark, who is Ziba Karbasi, who is an Iranian poet who writes very passionately, mostly about issues to do with Iran and the pain she feels about the situation there. And you can sort of feel that pain when she reads in Farsi. It's and the sort of the flowing tone of the language, and then her translator reads in English, and somehow the same passion cannot be conveyed. I don't know if that kind of answers the question. I mean, when we hold for example, our Exile Cafe nights at the Poetry Cafe in Covent Garden, we do hear a lot of poetry in other languages, and it can speak to you with, even though the poet may just have delivered to us a synopsis of the poem. So, I mean, there is a wonderful magazine called Modern Poetry in Translation, which sadly, in a way, does not include the original work, the work in the original language, but only in translation. I was placed in the difficult situation recently of having to do a sort of extempore translation of a poem from the French. It kind of was a Zoom session, and the actual poet was not able to make contact with us, so we put his poem up on the screen, and it was just so beautiful in French. And yes, so my translation was so sort of rough and ready. I'm sure if I gave this more thought, I could give a more considered response.
That's tremendous, though. Thanks, Jennifer. I think Alison and then Amir will want to come in.
Yeah, thanks, Jonathan. I mean, we've been working within the UNESCO chair, is the UNESCO chair for refugee integration through languages and the arts. So our work is multilingual all the time, and we spend a lot of time putting English last. Scotland's a bilingual country, Gaelic, but also officially recognises Scots and sign language. And so working multilingually is quite normal. And in quite a lot of the work I've done around the world, we see, we very much see people moving into English, into the language that might judge their immigration status, really unpoetic as a task. And that actually working with Indigenous languages is a much more poetic space for dealing with, be it nostalgia or anger or fear or beauty or surprise, you know, things which actually lend themselves, humor, which lend themselves to the arts. So within we've just finished 2 weeks of a spring school, which has been entirely multilingual, working and enabling people to just work with different words in different languages and to write poetry, maybe completely in another language or maybe in a language that is trans-languaging, to use the kind of jargon term, but which might dip in between Tigrinya and Bilen, and then have a little bit of a can, and then move into some really beautiful words that have been picked up from Gaelic or from Te Reo Māori, and we've just played with language as part of that opening of a space. Not to say that a poem has to mean, maybe it can just sound and feel for the time being, because maybe we're not yet ready to make sense. Maybe we need to actually let ourselves arrive before we find the words that will take us into a new life.
Thank you. And Amir.
Yeah, I think with the poetry and the mother language, interestingly, I don't write in my mother language. I write in English, and I've done that since after I wrote my first poem back in Syria, and then after that I moved in to learn English and to start to express myself in English. Then I wrote all my poetry in English, the 2 collections. But the thinking process is interesting, I think, for me as a poet, where the thinking happens in the mother language, then I try to translate that in my head into English, and then write it in English. So the thinking process happened in the mother language, then I write in English, trying to translate the cultural references, the other references, and everything else that matters in the poem. But the poem, as it will be read in its mother language, will still have the sound, will still have that touch of flavor to it, which sometimes when I hear poetry translated is missing. Other times it makes it better, surprisingly.
Again, thank you so much. So we're going to need to hand back to Lia at this point, although it's worth just flagging up that there is lots of useful comment and links that have been posted in the chat. So do make sure to look through all of that, including a particularly evocative quote that Rosemary has shared with us. You made up your mind to unmake mine. And she's asking whether that resonates with these experiences that have been shared of migration and exile. I think there will be very strong resonances, and it would have been lovely to have explored that a little too, but we're now out of time. So I'm going to hand back to Lia.
Thanks, Jonathan, and thank you, Ben. He's doing a phenomenal job, working at very great speed to find these links for us to put in the chat. We're going to turn now to the Helen Bamber Foundation. From the very beginning of this project, I knew that I wanted the proceeds of this book to be able to support the work of an organization that supports work with migrants. I considered a whole range of organizations, and really the Helen Bamber Foundation stood out because the types of people and questions that they ask were very much being picked up and discussed in the dialogue of the book as well. So I'm really delighted to be able to welcome Gareth Holmes today. Gareth is one of the directors of the Helen Bamber Foundation. He's been with the organization for about 8 years, and he'll tell us a bit more about the work that the foundation does. First, though, we're going to watch a short video narrated by Emma Thompson. And Ben, if you could line that up, we'll begin playing now.
You are looking at a metaphor. We're going to use it to tell you about the work of the Helen Bamber Foundation. We're using a metaphor because the experiences of the people the foundation helps are so appalling that they are almost impossible to describe or show. The extreme cruelty that survivors of trafficking and torture have gone through means that their trust has been obliterated. But if we can restore the trust, then the long road to recovery can begin. We can never know what it feels like to be a survivor, but this work shows what is possible when a society cares for those who are considered unfixable. We listen to their silences. We wait with them when no one else will. And with our help, the survivors eventually learn to manage their traumatic memories and restore their sense of dignity, so at last, their human spirit can soar again.
Thank you. Gareth, over to you now.
Thank you. Obviously, it's terrifying to speak after such wonderful, articulate poets. So please bear with me, because I am someone who works for the Helen Bamber Foundation and not a fantastic presenter and speaker like the previous panel. So I'm one of the directors of the Helen Bamber Foundation, and therefore also Asylum Aid, two organisations that support refugees and asylum seekers who have experienced torture and or human cruelty to a sort of extreme level. And the reason why I use both those words, torture and extreme human cruelty, is because torture in its traditional sense is considered as torture by a state official, but actually get different levels of support and rights if you've been abused by criminal gangs, and many of our clients have been trafficked and increasingly have been trafficked. The clients that we support are sort of on the more vulnerable sort of space within the refugee and asylum seeking groups, people who've been kept in solitary confinement and torture situations and forced sexual exploitation for many, many years. And what we do for those clients directly is that we have a number of different interventions that work together. So we have GPs who support clients, because I've got clients are too afraid to go to a GP, and if they did, they wouldn't disclose what happened. So we have GP sessions which last for hours, so they're able to talk through their sort of real physical needs. We are experts in treating trauma, so we have a mental health department, which is sort of the core of our work, supporting post-traumatic stress disorder, which all of our clients suffer from, but also other therapies and therapeutic interventions to support people to be able to move forward with their own lives. We have a big legal part of our organisation. Asylum Aid is purely legal and supports stateless people and undocumented children and people of that nature. But a lot of our work is in medical legal reports, so writing reports, telling the story of someone, so that they're able to gain status and safety. And then we also, on top of this, have community groups and poetry groups and also education and employability groups, because ultimately what we want to do is we want to give people not only that legal protection and that mental welfare and their physical welfare, but the ability to be able to sort of take their own lives back, mother and baby groups, so that you don't continue that sort of generational trauma, and lots and lots of pieces that all fit together. And I always feel bad talking about our clients as a singular, because one of the things that's most amazing about our clients is they are all completely and utterly different and have their own different stories and their own different needs and lots of sort of unique support and indeed offerings that they can bring to each other and the organisation. But there's also things that unite all of our clients, unfortunately, as having very, very shared experiences, and that's the othering. You know, there's often a sort of power divide that you see our clients have got into the situation from, the hostile environment, the unfair environment that they find themselves in, you know, things which are unthinkable of, and it sort of leads us into the second bit of our work, which is, because we work with some of the most vulnerable, complex people, we're able to change the environment of those individuals by changing policy, by changing laws, by training the police, by training the NHS to try and treat and support our clients better. We take this sort of external environment and we also support that wider from around the world. And so we write, for example, the care standards. We support the care standards for trafficking victims across Europe, and under, you know, and I suppose what's really, really important to remember is that at the base of all of this is a clients who are people. And if I just give a story of one of those clients, and I know I don't have a lot of time, but I think these two bits really play into what I've sort of heard today, and I think it was really interesting, is that a client of ours who was kept in confinement as a slave, essentially, for sexual exploitation, was kept underground in London for several years. And when the Metropolitan Police freed this person, one of the things, as well as all of the trauma and difficulties they had, was that they thought that they would be famous, that they would be freed with some sort of joy, and she was sort of articulating it around some of the people who've been captured and kept in torture situations from a Western environment, who the world and the whole world is outraged, but actually what was really shocking was no one was outraged. And in fact, they were put into detention centres and told they were a liar and told they need to go back, and various different pieces which were very bad, until the Helen Bamber Foundation came along. Now, they'd lost the ability to speak, and so they needed lots and lots of therapy and lots of support. And now you would not recognise this person, and we have dinner on Fridays with our clients. Well, we used to before the pandemic, and this particular client had a bucket full of products, cleaning products and wipers and different cloths. And when she was taking this bucket round to all of the other clients, and they were picking things up, she was going, don't touch them, you know, leave them, these are mine. So I said, well, what is it with what is this bucket? Why have you brought this? And she said, I'm going to tell everyone. She gets up onto her stool and she said, when I first came to the foundation, I couldn't talk and I was scared and I didn't trust anyone. And now I am a cleaner of a car phone warehouse shop in London, and I can use all my own products. I'm allowed to go where I want and do what I want. And what was so extraordinary about this is how unextraordinary the sort of amazing thing that had the rest of the clients in the room in tears, which is, it's incredible that you have come so far and you've made it so far. And so that's the Helen Bamber Foundation in a nutshell. It seems very nuanced, but you know, it's about long-term integrated care to help some of the most vulnerable people move into a position where they can take control of their own life and support other people, because we have a lot of peer-led work that we do with our clients who come back in and who run our groups, and we have a lady who runs our a group to save money as an asylum seeker, and honestly, if you heard her speak, you would have your notebook out, because she has saved me so much money. She knows absolutely every way of getting the best out of every penny that she has, and so a lot of our clients come back to support other clients who are going through that journey. I believe there's time for questions later on, but that I think is my time up. So that's us.
Gareth, I think we have a couple of minutes to take maybe one question, possibly two from the audience, if anyone would like to ask about the Helen Bamber Foundation.
Stunned silence means I must have done a great job.
I believe Ben is going to pop the web address into the chat space, but I really do encourage everyone to go take a look at the website. So I'm so glad that we were able to develop this relationship with the foundation. Alison has her hands up.
I just wanted to thank Gareth for taking time to speak to us, and just was absolutely delighted when Lia said that this was what she wanted to do with proceeds from the book. And just, you know, I have family members who have been really touched by and helped by interactions with the Helen Bamber Foundation, and I know your work is utterly transformational. And that you are able to give people laughter again, that seems to be part of the beauty of the work that you do, and that you pick up these broken fragments of people's lives and then find a way of making them whole, and then that sign comes. And that picture that you just gave was giving me goosebumps of, you know, somebody standing on a chair with a mop and bucket and saying, look at me, you know, rather than not being able to speak, and that sense of the silencing just being very, very normal as an experience of people whose lives have been utterly shattered by torture. So just wanted to say thank you and just support the work that you're doing.
No, thank you. You've been fantastic. Thank you.
Gareth, there's one question that came in from Elliot. If you could maybe respond very briefly. What methods does Helen Bamber and Asylum Aid find most useful to give voice to migrants while also protecting them?
So it's very difficult. There's different ways to demonstrate voice, and one of the great things is having organisations that actually. This is going to be a very boring answer. I'm sorry for the boringness of this, but a lot of our clients aren't able to talk for many reasons. A lot of it is safety. So there's often criminal gangs who are still looking for those individuals and who are still actively seeking to pull them into slavery. And so it can be difficult. But we're a clinical organisation. We measure absolutely everything, and we are meticulous with what we show works, with results that work, with things that help people. And as a result, for example, our evidence can't be refuted by the Home Office. So we have special dispensation, much to the unhappiness of various different sectors. But you know, it's that evidence. It's actually gathering that information and putting it forward to decision makers and to people that actually do really, really want to help refugees and asylum seekers. And an example of this is, you know, the police often asking for training, because actually a lot of one of the issues with the police is not a complete lack of compassion for trafficking victims, but in some ways lack of understanding. In Asylum Aid, to give you an example, they support children who are victims of trafficking, and victims of trafficking who are children often don't recognise themselves as victims of trafficking, so they don't disclose that they have been trafficked. That's not, they don't identify as that. And so, you know, actually education and working with that evidence base to try and spread that word and get that out there to to third parties, decision makers, statutory services, because actually that's where sort of those key bits of help happen. And unfortunately, sometimes the answers are simple, but the system which surrounds those answers is purposefully hostile. And so one way to use the voices of refugees and asylum seekers is to show what amazing voices those individuals have. It's not always possible with our clients, but this is why I was so excited to read the book and to understand what everyone here is doing.
Thank you. And Elliot, thank you so much for that question on the subject of striking that balance between giving voice and protecting the clients. I'm hoping that we can do just that with the final poem that we'll be reading this evening. This was a poem written by Angela, who's a client of the Helen Bamber Foundation. For all of the reasons that Gareth was explaining, we cannot give her full name, but she wrote this extraordinary poem a few years ago and has given consent for it to be read. And the poets that are here with us this evening are going to do that. And my hope is that in doing this, we can give Angela some of her voice in this space. I'll turn it over to you now, Alison.
À la fondation d'Alain Bamber sont nos heures les plus sombres. Il n'y aurait pas d'étoiles filantes. At the Helen Bamber Foundation, without our darkest hours, there would be no shooting stars.
Her mind had been poisoned into darkness. For weeks, she had walked up and down the hall, taking small peeks. She was in her darkest hours. Everything was filled with gloom. As she sat in a chair across the room, her tears a steady stream cascading down her cheeks. Halting mid-speech, she was scared to speak. She began to talk about her fears and dreams, but it was obvious. She was crumbling at every seam. And while nothing was said, a whisper breezed past. You are not alone.
She listened intently, not sure what to believe. She had only known disruption, but she was the key. She was a guardian of information, yet all she wanted to do was leave, dividing and conquering through that hurt and pain. Her words spitting out everything without thinking of the shame. She soon began to open up and share her truth hidden within. She felt relieved like she had never known, singing out everything like a broken violin.
Weeks, months, and years passed by. She felt safe, her mind coming slowly into frame. She could hardly wait to hand over what was on her chest. For once, that lingering feeling began to melt away. She no longer felt oppressed. She drew on all her emotions, coding them into a string, like she was almost impressed, and nourished her soul with the compassion she had been shown. She was no perfect or without her faults like a firestone, but she soon began to feel her scars and realized they were not hers alone. By Angela, very powerful.
Thank you, Tawona. Mira has been in his family for 6 generations, and we caught a glimpse of your toddler earlier. Perhaps she'll learn from you one of these days. We're nearing the end of our time. I just want to say that this book was made possible through the support of the Susanna Wesley Foundation based at the University of Roehampton. The Susanna Wesley Foundation is a community of scholarship that is dedicated to practical theology and to equipping faith communities and the people who work with them and in them. If you go to the website, you'll find resources and reflection materials related to the book. I have to say that this is still very much a work in progress, but it does at this point include an archive of audio recordings from each of the poets who contributed, including some of the poems that you heard read today. Also, as I mentioned earlier, there are discount codes available from the publisher. These are for both the ebook and for the paperback. I believe Ben is going to post them. The codes are both good through 2021, so please do feel free to make use of them. And the royalties, of course, will be going to the Helen Bamber Foundation. So this just leaves me to say thank you to Alison, Tawona, Jennifer, and Amir. Thank you to Gareth for joining us, and especially to Angela for letting us read her poem today. Thanks as well to Jonathan and Ben and the wonderful Heart Edge team, and also to my colleagues at the Susanna Wesley Foundation for all their support in bringing this event together. And thanks to all of you for joining us virtually today. I know that many of you will be watching it as a recording later on. I look forward to seeing you at some point in the not too distant future for the final session of this 4-part series on mapping faith. Thanks very much.
Much thanks to all of our contributors and poets today, to Amir, Jennifer, Alison, Tawona, and especially to Lia for her organisation of the series and her leading of the session today. We are hugely grateful. Ben has been dropping information in the chat about other Heart Edge events that are coming up in the near future, and also where you can find out how to join and be a part of Heart Edge if that's of interest to you. Just one particular event to flag up, given the interfaith dimension to this particular series. Beginning on Sunday is a 3-part series of conversations on the nature of Christian and Jewish relations in the 21st century, with the conversation happening between Rabbi Daniel Epstein from Western Marble Arch Synagogue and the Reverend Dr. Sam Wells, who is Vicar of St. Martin in the Fields. So that's well worth coming along to, as are all of the other events that we're giving information about that's in the chat now. Thank you so much for coming and for all that you've shared. Do feel free to save the chat with all the information that's been included if you wish to do that. We look forward to seeing you again on another occasion. And once again, much thanks to all of the poets and to Lia for all that's been shared today. Thank you all for joining us. See you soon.